Emma of Normandy, referred to as Aelfgifu in English documents, was born in 984 to Duke Richard the Fearless of Normandy and his wife Gunna, and was the great-aunt of the future Duke William the Conqueror. To avoid invasion by Vikings using Normandy as a staging point to invade England and thus create a Norman alliance, Emma was married to the Anglo-Saxon King Ethelred the Unready from 1002 to 1016, by whom she had 3 children, Edward, later the Confessor, a daughter, Godda, and another son, Alfred. In her second marriage, to Canute from 1017 to his death in 1035, which was also political but later affectionate, she bore 2 more children, Arthur Canute, later King of England from 1040 to 1042, and a daughter, Gunilda. Emma's sons by Ethelred were already safely in Normandy under the protection of her brother, Duke Richard II. Canute had been previously married to a noble English lady, Aelfgifu of Northampton from about 1013, with whom he had 2 other sons, Sweyn and Harold, nicknamed Harefoot. It was a Danish-style handfast marriage and thus not church-approved, and many considered her merely Canute's mistress. Aelfgifu was from an important noble family in Mercia, a daughter of Aelfhelm, ealdorman of southern Northumbria, and his wife Dulfran. Her family were either treacherous or just unlucky. Aelfhelm was killed in 1006, probably at the command of King Ethelred, and her brothers, Ufgit and Wulfhere, were both blinded. The family again came under suspicion during the invasion of England by Sweyn Forkbeard in 1013, and yet further family members were charged with treachery and killed. As a mother, Aelfgifu soon became Emma's bitterest rival, as both women fiercely sought to outmaneuver the other to each ensure that their sons became king. In 1030, Canute sent Aelfgifu and their eldest son Sweyn to reign in Norway, but their rule was so harsh that the Norse rebelled and they were later driven out in 1035, while Sweyn died of wounds in Denmark shortly after. So Emma was to act as regent until his return, which she did in rivalry with her stepson, Harold Harefoot. Canute did return to England that same year, but died shortly after, sparking a succession crisis. Simeon of Durham and Adam of Bremen suggest that Canute had reserved the English throne for Harold, while the Encomium Emmae Reginae, written to defend Emma, claims that he had done so for Arthur Canute. Aelfgifu was determined that her surviving son Harold should be the next English king. The death of Sweyn soon after his father Canute removed a claimant, so a grieving Aelfgifu returned quickly to England to rescue the situation, as Emma's son Arthur Canute was away in Denmark, at war with the Norwegian king Magnus I. Emma's other, estranged sons, Alfred and Edward, whom she not even seen for 20 years, stayed in Normandy. In the following months, Harold and Aelfgifu traveled the country bribing and threatening the powerful and the influential over to their cause, until Harold eventually became extremely powerful. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, version C, D&D, describes how Harold and his men forcefully laid claim on the treasury in Winchester, where Canute was buried and where Emma had taken up residence. Her royal seal was also there. The Witan, a council of the greatest magnates, earls, clerics and nobles in England, decided that Harold should rule, but only as regent until Arthur Canute arrived. During 1036 Emma was becoming desperate. She had lost her status and power, also she and her son were living in fear of Regent King Harold and Aelfgifu. Alfred Atheling and Edward, Emma's exiled sons by Ethelred, each separately returned to England from their exile in Normandy under assurances of safe passage in order to visit their mother. Back in 1016 the young royal princes had escaped during Canute's violent purges of the Saxon nobility and safely been smuggled to her Norman relatives, and they were wary and suspicious. Edward sailed to England with an armed band of Normans. but not large enough to stoke revolt or seize the crown, so he returned to Normandy. Maybe he really aimed to effect a coup to overthrow his mother's rival Aelfgifu and hated stepson, King Harold Harefoot, who had usurped the throne from his own half-brother, Arthur Canute. This, however, would be a threat to Earl Godwin, who owed his meteoric rise to power under Canute, but as Arthur Canute was still absent, he now seemed to have shifted his allegiance to Harold. Now Edward's brother Alfred sailed for England with an armed retinue. Narrowly avoiding capture, he landed on the English south coast and moved overland, heading for London. His party was greeted in an apparently friendly guise by Earl Godwin's armed retinue. Godwin swore fealty to Alfred. During their time in England they were supposed to be protected and housed by King Arthur Canute, but he was still in Denmark. Godwin escorted Alfred and his retinue to safety at Guildford, away from London, where King Harold was. He billeted them in small separate groups around the town for the night, drinking or sleeping. Then he slipped away for Harefoot's armed men to covertly approach, ambush and arrest them as they rested, drank or slept. Whilst a snatch squad grabbed Prince Alfred, some escaped in the confusion and darkness, but the rest were seized. At dawn the captured men were dragged outside, lined up, mocked and clapped in irons. Cruelly, all but every 10th man was murdered in cold blood. Some were blinded, scalped, mutilated, or had hands and feet cut off. Many were beaten and later sold into slavery. Bound, mocked and tortured himself, Alfred was shipped to the remote Isle of Ely and there was pinned down and blinded so brutally by the young king's henchmen that, despite loving care by Ely monks, he died in excruciating agony 5 weeks later. Emma, sickened by grief for her dead son and Edward already safely back in Normandy, now joined him, driven out by Harefoot. Later she played a part in getting her favourite son, Arthur Canute, to invade England with 60 ships. Encomium Emma Reginae places the blame of Alfred's capture, torture and murder completely on Harold Harefoot, thinking he intended to rid himself of 2 more potential claimants to the English throne by killing Edward and Alfred. Some scholars make the argument that it could have been Godwin, Earl of Wessex, who was travelling with Alfred and Edward as their protector in passage. Many suspected that Emma sent for her 2 previous, exiled sons by Ethelred, Alfred and Edward, as Arthur Canute was still in Denmark. That she played upon their inheritance now that Canute was dead, twisting the situation and beckoning them into a scene she knew might kill them, just so she could win her own power back. Alfred had clearly been set up, but by whom? Emma would later claim that the letter she sent to them was a forgery concocted by Harefoot's scribes, on his orders to lure the 2 princes to England into a trap. Both sides had, in an age of illiteracy, been known to forge letters, and Harefoot's men had seized the royal treasury, where Emma herself was, which would have likely included the royal seal with which to fake letters. Emma's encomium attributes to her even more seriously dishonest methods. She makes Aelfgifu an accomplice in the murder of Emma's youngest son, Alfred, by suggesting that she was responsible for sending a forged letter to Normandy inviting Alfred to England. The encomium also claimed that Aelfgifu's son Harold was a servant's son. Later, Norman propagandists naturally blamed the anti-Norman Earl Godwin for the grisly deed, but it is strange that even Alfred's mother, Emma, known as being an unstable woman prone to wild accusations, never blamed Godwin. Was this because she herself was guilty of the devious plan which sent one of her sons to his death? Arthur Canute angrily put Godwin on trial for the brutal death of his half-brother, Alfred, although he had never met him. The Earl made an oath to the new king that what was done was on the direct orders of Harold Harefoot and as a good soldier, he was merely following those orders. To prove his renewed loyalty, Godwin and Bishop Lyfing, who were involved in the detention of Alfred Atheling, were made to attend the desecration of Harold Harefoot's grave. Lyfing was deprived of his see in punishment. The late king was dug up and his rotting body dumped into a nearby fen with animal bones and sewage, then later the Thames. Godwin also had to swear oaths, and provide oathsayers to support them, that he had no part in Alfred's blinding and in fact counselled against it. Godwin also appealed to the new king's vanity and greed. He offered Canute a beautifully crafted Viking ship, with gilt prow and furnished with arms and hand-picked warriors, clad in triple mail hauberks, and who were carrying golden and bejeweled swords, axes and shields. The gift, which showed Godwin's immense wealth and importance, was accepted, but the oath was more important and he stood to lose a lot by the impulsive killing of such an important and useful commander like Godwin. In 1040, Harefoot collapsed suddenly and died whilst celebrating a wedding. A grieving Aelfgifu, upon the early death of her only son, and in the face of the vengeful Canute's huge invasion, fled and vanished from history. Edward returned to England and became king in 1042, never forgetting or forgiving the atrocity, always blaming his own mother and also Godwin, now his most powerful earl as well as his father-in-law, who swore stern oaths denying direct complicity and that he was acting upon royal orders. It is said that Edward refused to consummate his marriage to Edith, Godwin's daughter, in revenge. In any case, their childless marriage led directly to the bloodbaths of 1066 and the revolution that would forever change England, and later the world. Emma, whose eldest sons she had not even seen for 2 decades before the murder, failed to reconcile with her embittered son, King Edward, who even briefly dispossessed her of titles, possessions and lands for treason. On the advice of Earls Leofric, Godwin and Siward, he accused her of abusing court powers to amass great treasures, of abandoning he and his brother and of conspiring with Magnus of Norway to supplant him. But he soon relented. Emma was allowed to stay in England, in very modest trappings, out of favour and barely any servant ladies, until her death in 1052 aged 68.